Have you ever wondered how to utilize AI for real estate? Whether you're a programmer or not, I'm going to show you how you can be equipped with the right tools to discover new markets to either invest in or live in. In just a few moments, I'm going to walk you through how to analyze a market by using free economic data from the US Census. I'll run a Python notebook and use an example that I'm familiar with and live in Tampa, Florida. But first, a little bit about myself. My name is Ariel Herrera, CTO of Coffee Closers, and although I live in Tampa today, I am a New Jersey native. I also went to the state school, Rutgers University, go RU, and I started my career as a business analyst and quickly pivoted my way over to data science once I caught the bug of automation and programming. I now live in Tampa, Florida, which really caters to my lifestyle since I'm a huge beach bum. But you can't take the New Jersey roots out of me, and I'm a big fan of the Yankees. Every time I come to Tampa, I try to see them play. Over the last 4 years of being involved in the real estate space and interacting with the community, I found three main reasons people never get started. First, researching where to invest is difficult, especially out of state. Deciding on a strategy is overwhelming, especially given so many options like house hacking, BRRRR, fix and flip, and don't even get me started on creative financing as well. Finding the right property is hard. In hot markets like, say, Houston, Texas, you can find thousands, sometimes even over 7,000 properties that are currently on market. How do you filter that down just to one? For the purpose of this video, I'm going to focus specifically on researching a market. How are we able to solve this with data? First, my story. When I first started in real estate investing about 5 years ago, there were three main factors I was looking for: a cash flowing property, a turnkey property with minimal renovations, and a property in an up and coming area so I could leverage time and appreciation since I was investing in my mid 20s. I was particularly looking for a neighborhood that was about C plus B minus, which I'll get into those grades in a moment, so that I could see it become a B plus A in the future. And to find these deals, I use resources like Zillow for searching for properties, Excel for analyzing deals, and the US Census for macro and micro economic stats to analyze a market. And the reason I did it this way is simply because that was how I was taught to do it in the books as well as the forums that I read. However, I would come to find out that this manual process wasn't ideal. So let's dive into specifically how to find an up and coming area. So I want to ask you, the viewer, a question. What factors contribute to an up and coming area? I'm just going to give you some quick stats that most of us are familiar with. A growing population. So usually if people are now coming to an area, maybe there's more jobs available or perhaps more amenities. We could start to see that this area is starting to have more people and thus can be up and coming. As well, low unemployment. Typically, as an area starts to trend as an up and coming area, you start to get more affluent people in and those who have and maintain employment. Now, there's probably many other factors running through your head right now. I'm going to show you the ones that I initially focused in on when I started real estate investing. So for my first deal ever, I was looking for four main attributes for an up and coming area. First, transportation. At the time, I was commuting to New York City about 2 hours each way on a bus. And I wanted to try to use public transportation, like a train, to be able to cut that time down in half. I thought if I want to do this, others surely will as well. So I took all of New Jersey and now started to just focus in on specific towns that had train stops. The second attribute I was looking for was affordability. So for one, I didn't want to break the bank on my first deal to acquire my first property that I was going to live in. But second, I also wanted to be an affordable area that could have a larger tenant pool. So for example, if I was renting out a property that was around $2,000 in New Jersey, that could have a larger tenant pool, including blue collar workers too, who typically stay in a property longer. As well, in an economic downturn, when people downsize, they look for properties that have lower rents as well, but are still in good areas. Now, going for number three, I was looking for high ownership to rent ratio. So typically in neighborhoods that are close to train stations, sometimes you could find those that are sketch. And that's what I started to see when I looked at neighborhoods in New Jersey that had good transportation, were affordable tended to have a large skew to renters, and thus a lot of the properties weren't as maintained. You would walk through the neighborhoods and you would see grass not maintained as well as some trash. So I was looking to find an area that was at least 60-40, 60% ownership to see neighborhoods that had pride. Last being new development. I was looking for an area that was a C plus, B minus that can become a B plus A in the future, and thus looking for long term appreciation. So, things that I would search on Google, which you could use Gemini today as an LLM, is searching for your city and seeing what is new development coming. So, I was looking for things like new transportation, like a ferry, as well as new apartment complexes and new warehouses that could be coming to the area to improve employment even more. So, after about 3 months of research, I was able to land my first deal, which was a house hack in South Amboy, New Jersey, right by the water, and also only 50 minutes to get into New York City by train or 45 through ferry. What I have here in red was actually not built when I first purchased the property. This was all woods as well as dried debris. However, I knew if I could wait maybe 5 years till it could become something and actually finish development, it could be a good property in the long term. Fast forward a year, and I'm looking to purchase my next deal, but finding cash flow in New Jersey is practically impossible. So I started to look out of state. And I followed the same process I did before, but was met with a whole new series of challenges. Looking out of state, finding a deal becomes extremely difficult and time consuming. I'm tracking multiple markets at a time, manually plugging each one into an Excel sheet to add a deal. I then cross check the area against macroeconomic stats like median household income and employment rates to confirm it's in an up and coming area. And when I tried to use existing solutions, which many of you may have tried before, I found this very problematic. One, if I looked for stats like median household income, I was met with too high level, looking at states or counties. I need to know what neighborhoods or streets to invest in, not that high level of looking at an entire state. So therefore, a lot of these sites were not useful to me. Or in the second end, they were way too detailed. I wasn't writing a thesis on an area. I just needed to know if it was good or not. So at this stage, I felt completely overwhelmed because I was analyzing at first only a couple markets in New Jersey to now hundreds across the US, and it was very time consuming. This is where I thought there had to be a better way. I have data analytics skills, and my day job is to try to build models or dashboards to be able to drive insights. So, why can't I do that with my own investments? And that's why I started the YouTube channel to be able to leverage my skills in data analytics and share it with others so they wouldn't face the same pain points I did. Now, let's walk through the notebook to actually dive into how you could use data for market discovery. Here I have a Python notebook in Google Colab. Google Colab is a free notebook environment to be able to run Python scripts without having anything installed on your machine. What this means is that if you are brand new to Python, you could literally open up this link and run everything as is. Now, if you're new to Python, I encourage you to take my free course that I have on YouTube to take you from Python beginner to intermediate using real estate examples. The first thing we're looking at is US Census data. What is US Census data? So, the American Community Survey is an ongoing survey that provides data every single year. Now, there's a 10-year one that is done that tries to encompass data across the entire United States of the whole population. This one is sample set that looks at about 1 out of every 39 people, but is still very, very useful. When looking at the data, you're going to hear me say neighborhood as well as census tract. Census tract is the actual term that is defined by the US Census of a collection of streets within an area, have usually a population of 5,000 or so. The reason why US Census is very important is because real estate is hyper local. So here are the regions defined by the US Census, and we could see they have data at the nation level, zip code level, region, division, states, counties, and what we're looking at is census tracts. You may have heard of block groups as well, which is even more defined. However, I find it to be such a small sample set that it is a little bit more difficult to draw conclusions from, which is why I look at census tracts. And here you could see a video directly from a data specialist from the US Census who talks about tracts. Next step is running our imports. So bringing in packages that will help us to analyze our data, our functions, which I'm going to detail in a moment, and actually reading in our data. So I actually have put together a data set from the US Census that I gathered, and it's specifically for Florida data for 2022 at the US Census tract level. All this means is that there's a CSV file publicly available on GitHub that you can read in to immediately start working with the data rather than worrying about pre-processing and the whole data extraction up front. So here we could see that we have a CSV file, which is similar to an Excel file with rows and columns, and we define that as a data frame. Our data frame has about 5,000 rows, 99 columns. Now, these census tracts have their own names and as well as their own IDs. We have data here. We could see total population, median household income, gross rent, median home value, education, and more. I'm going to detail each of these, but let's get right to the visualization so it's easier for you to see. Next thing we're reading in is tract data. And I've specified this in prior videos using US Census data, is that in order to visualize it, you need to provide to the map what is the actual graphic region or polygon so that it can know what the boundary is. So we're reading this in from the US Census, the latest year, which I have is 2022, and for the state of Florida, which is 12. So now we have two data frames, one that has all of our featurized data, another one that has our location. Next, if we want to actually explore our data, for any data frame, you could use Describe. And here I'm just formatting everything to be only 2 decimals. And we could see we have our 4,000, almost 5,000 rows and a distribution of our data set. So across these census tracts, the way you would read this is for total population, the minimum is 336 people. The maximum is about 23,000 people, and the median being about 4,000 people. So we have this across all of our feature sets, and we can dive right into the data itself and look at numbers, but I personally like to visualize things, so let's get to that as soon as possible. We could see for our data set what our top counties are for Florida, most of them Miami, Broward County, which is by Miami, Palm Beach, Hillsborough, which is Tampa, Florida, and some others. Now, if I wanted to explore just Hillsborough County, I'm going to merge this with our tract data so that we have now at the very end, we have information on geometry, so it can now plot our data. And if I try to visualize Hillsborough County median household income, we now have a plotly chart that shows us median household income on a scale. So the darker the color, the lower the median household income. The higher the color, so the more yellow, the higher the median income. And if we start to zoom in, we could see that this area around here has some concentration of wealth, whereas if we look at this part of the city, it has less wealth, where we see median household income around 26,000 versus over here, which is 172,000. Me being a local, I know that this area has a lot of million-dollar homes as well as boats right off the water. Now, looking at a single value, median household income, is pretty cool to look at, but it doesn't give us any measure as to what area to invest in and what we should do with this data. So why single values are not enough? Single values are snapshots in time. By looking at changes, so looking at year over year, for example, we could start to see if things are trending upwards or downwards, helping us find the up and coming part of an area. So now looking at the same data set, I'm still looking at Hillsborough County. I'm going to look at median household income year over year. So instead of looking at the latest, which was 2022, I'm going to see how for each tract, each neighborhood, we've seen a change from 2021 to 2022. Have we seen median household income go up or have we seen it go down? So now our map looks slightly different than we had before. Our scale is also different. We have some negative values and then we have positive as well. Zooming in, we could see that one of these areas in Ybor City of Tampa actually has had about 54% of growth in median household income year over year. And if we look at this area up top, and if I actually zoom in a little bit, this area was actually just labeled, a purple, that it had lower median household income in relation to the rest of the city. So by looking at year over year changes, we could say, looks like there's some growth happening here. Maybe we want to explore it. Now, because I'm from the area, I know that Ybor City is transforming. It's actually having a lot more newer builds as well, where old 1940s homes are being torn down in favor of new construction. So even though we now are looking at year over year changes, what are we still lacking? So we're still lacking context. A single value like median income doesn't tell us how it compares to a benchmark. For example, is this 54% growth only good in Tampa, or is it pretty much the same of what we're seeing across the state? And giving us that context really helps with significance. So if we go down and start to look at state averages for Florida, we could see the median household income is $67,000 about for 2022. And the year over year change percentage is 9.9%. So that tract is beating the state average by almost 5 times, which is pretty amazing. It's having a lot of growth. So I added some quick metrics here in order for us to gauge how our median household income looks at the tract level in comparison to the state level. So now we're looking at both and looking at year over year as well. So even though for Tampa, it pretty much is similar in terms of the state, where I saw that this is really useful was areas like Detroit, Michigan, where you could start to see a lot of growth, for example, in relation to other tracts within Detroit. But when you look at the whole city of Michigan, it's still an underperforming city in some aspects. So that's why it's really important to benchmark when you're looking at location, not just for a particular city, county, but also state. So we've been able to so far take a state, which is Florida, look across census tracts for a particular city, Tampa, Florida, to then be able to look at a single value, which was median household income. Now, I'm not making an investment decision based off of one single value. That's not going to tell me everything about a neighborhood. If I'm looking for an up and coming neighborhood, I need to understand if not just income is rising, but how is the population growing? What does the total education look like as well? Are we seeing more folks with bachelor's degree move in or doctorate's degrees? Or we're seeing folks that are less educated come to the area? This is where a neighborhood score is so useful. Being able to actually analyze all these metrics across and bring a single score to make a decision. So here I'm creating a single field called neighborhood score using the function economics neighborhood map score. So I'm going to dive into what this function is. Now, although I want to preface, this is not the function that we use for coffee closers. This is specifically to try to show a simple example of how you can combine metrics and start to measure different areas. If you want to do this on your own, definitely look at more metrics instead of these 10 that I have here. I encourage you to do so. Also, I encourage you to look at other machine learning methods, statistical methods, or even AI methods as well. I plan to have future videos where I detail how to actually use different methodologies, but for the purpose of this video, I want to keep it high level and as simple as possible. All right, so right to it, here we have this function, and we have a dictionary that has different metrics. So we see population growth in comparison to state, median household income in comparison to state, rent to state, median house value, newer builds, etc. So these were all features I got for free from the US Census. And then I'm now putting this into a dictionary. I'm looking at the percentage difference between the value for that tract versus the entire state. And then based on this, I'm scoring it. So if we see that a tract has higher median household income than the state, it's going to get a 1. If it does not, it gets a 0. So it's a very simple, rudimentary way to score how a tract is comparing to the state, and it's going to be a value between 0 and 1. We could now observe that a little bit more. So we could see what we basically did is that we now have a formula that compares these 10 different metrics for 2 different geographic regions, a tract and a state, And we have one single score that compares how often this left-hand side tract beats out the right-hand side state. So in this simple example, I'm looking at one single tract in Hillsborough County, Florida, which is Tampa, Florida. We could see that this tract total population has grown 5%, whereas the state was 1% from 2021 to 2022. Median household income is almost 3 times the state. Gross rent, higher than the state. Median home value is also higher than the state, and so on. So here we can actually start to visualize or even start to look at what are the top areas that had the highest neighborhood scores. In this case, it was a tract in Miami-Dade, second by a tract in Santa Rosa, and one in Duval County. Then if we want to visualize this, which is my favorite part, I love using Plotly, we can now view our scores. So we could see if we combine all of those metrics, some of the areas that had the highest amount, so meeting and beating state averages, was this area in Brandon, Florida, over here as well, and some of South Florida, which is to be expected. But also, if we look at here, which is Seminole Heights area, North Seminole Heights, has actually had a ton of growth, which I used to live close to this area, so I'm very familiar. Tons of breweries that have just opened up there. So overall, this map helps us to get an overview of how an actual tract stands in comparison to the state across different metrics rather than just one. Awesome. So we just went over the notebook walkthrough of a simple example of how you could use economic data for free to be able to see a given area and understand how their neighborhood trends in relation to others within the same area, as well as the entire state. However, if we want to identify up and coming areas, like what's actually emerging, what's an area that I can invest in now and see it appreciate down the line, like the next Hoboken, which is my goal one day to get, is census data enough? And the answer is no, for a couple of reasons. And I'm going to go into those, but there are 3 additional factors that we at Coffee Closers and I've been able to develop in the algorithm to look at to consider areas that are up and coming. First being leading indicators. So we just went over macro and microeconomic stats. And while that's great context to understand an area, this data lags. What I showed you was 2022 data, and right now of recording, this is May of 2024. That's not going to help me to understand how a market is moving. I need to have real-time data. So we look at as well as market data and amenities. So market data, think about a neighbor. When a neighbor puts their house up for sale, what's one of the first things you do? For me, it's searching that property and seeing what they're putting it up for, because that helps me to assess what my property may be worth, as well as how our whole entire neighborhood is trending. So it's really important to look at what's sold, what's the recent activity, as well what's on market. Even though the US Census may have values for properties, it's very outdated. And if we have that monthly view, seeing that prices have increased in an area, that can help us to understand its trending and thus becoming an up and coming area. As well, looking at amenities. For example, is there a Whole Foods that just opened nearby? Is there an Equinox that is coming to the area? By almost piggybacking off of these large institutional companies that have thousands, tens of thousands of dollars to spend on this type of analysis, we can jump on that train and be able to find areas that are going to be influenced by these amenities. So with these 3 combined, especially these bottom 2, it helps us to get a real-time view by having a wider data set to look at. And if you're thinking, oh man, I wanted to really do this on my own with the Python notebook and be able to bring market data, well, you can. Maybe not at the track level. However, if you want to go down to, say, the zip code level, Redfin, Zillow, Realtor, and Apartment List all post for free how the market is moving by looking at rental trends, sales trends, inventory, and more. So I highly encourage you to check this out. As well, in my course, Introduction to Real Estate Data Analytics, the whole idea is to bring you from Python beginner to hero using real estate and leveraging all of these tools. Now, when it comes to data, you may be thinking, hey, you haven't talked about crime at all. That's the number one thing I hear about when looking at an area. Now, I want to know who's told you that, and has it ever come from a data scientist perspective? because from my research, there are three main problems with crime. First, it's outdated. The free crime that's available, published by the FBI as of the recording May 2024, is from 2021. So that is severely outdated of what's happening. Second, crime can be underreported. It's not a perfect metric, especially with a lot of the social climates that have occurred over the last several years. Third, the FBI specifically states not to use their crime data for rankings. And if you look at the right hand side, something I've noticed as well, if you use sites like crimegrade.org, one thing that I've always noticed is that suburbs will always be green with minimal crime. And then you'll have cities which are going to have basically a whole map of red, which really frustrates me because as an investor, this is telling me basically don't ever invest in cities, which I know not to be true. Therefore, instead of using specific crime data because of the problems I just listed, we use instead correlated features. What are some things that you may think of that could influence crime? Probably a drop in median household income, a drop of population because people are now more worried of their area, so they're moving out of that given place. Also, education might drop in this instance as well. So by using correlated features, we can infer crime without falling into the traps that many people don't tell you about. The second thing that we look at, that's an additional part for identifying up and coming areas, is the condition of a property. It's really important to assess what type of properties are in a given neighborhood. Typically, you will see that A neighborhoods have maybe 15 years or less of homes for age, B areas around 10 to 30 years, and then C areas less than that, with properties not being rehabbed in a long time. So in order for us to look at distressed properties, we look at property descriptions. So for example, that's a real life property in Tampa, Florida that's boarded up. And if we look at the description, we could see that there are some keywords here that help us to understand that this is a property that needs rehab. So by being able to define if this is a fixer upper with things like property needs full rehab, sold as is, it helps us to gauge how many of these properties being sold are distressed versus those that are turnkey, maybe have courts and are luxury finishes. Another thing that helps us to gauge condition of properties is flipping activity. Things we look at include recently sold property. So how do we know something was flipped, something was remodeled? And why do we even care? Flipping activity is really important because it helps to see areas that are being revitalized. So there's a new likely influx of population coming in, and they want to be in homes that they can live in from the jump. A lot of these properties are older, so there needs to be some sort of rehab to make it livable. And we have these flippers that come in, and there's usually four methods here. They pay in cash, they buy and they flip within 12 months, usually because that's how the hard money loans work. They usually buy through an LLC, and they should at least sell the properties for a higher price than they bought it. So by looking at these factors, we can see the flipping activity for a given area. And if you wanted more information specifically on this flip activity, I have a 3-part series on how to use NLP and Python to identify fixer-uppers. As well, I have a conversation with our co-host Jose to discuss flipping activity across the country using Real Estate API, and he has that Python code in GitHub to use as well. The last of the three that we also look at for identifying up-and-coming areas is nearest neighbor analysis. So even though a specific neighborhood or tract may not have a Whole Foods or may not have things that indicate that it's up and coming, maybe we can actually understand the area's potential based on what it's close to. Is it close to other areas that are impoverished? Is it close to areas that have started to experience revitalization? Or is it nearby areas that have had new amenities? By using statistical measures, we're able to see how close different neighborhoods are to one another, how each one is trending, and thus, what is the likelihood that that specific neighborhood will trend higher in the future too. So given all of this analysis, what is the output? The output of having leading indicators, knowing condition of properties, nearest neighbor analysis, we are able to produce a neighborhood grade map. So taking you from many different data sets as well as features to just giving you one single score per tract so you can understand and be able to invest with confidence what an area type is like. And of course, this is meant for analysis. And then when you want to get more granular, actually going to an agent to really assess the boots on the ground of what maybe streets you should look at within these different tracks. But ultimately, by using data, we can really cut the time. And this I've worked on for the last 3 months or so and have received feedback from over 50 individuals, investors, agents, and wholesalers on how to improve this map, make it better. And really, really, this is a culmination of all of us together, of the feedback, of the work, and what we're able to produce. What's next is building your own map. So I showed you a little bit of that Python notebook, but I actually plan to have a live Python workshop. Depending on the interests will be depending on how I actually run it. I will definitely likely be doing it for the Tampa data science group. When it comes to YouTube audience, it really is dependent on how many people want to be involved. And maybe we could even live stream it or do a separate session. But because defining what matters to you in real estate is somewhat subjective, I want to see what you're able to produce in terms of scores. Maybe you want to build a neighborhood grade map that is specific for someone who is retiring and it really goes towards those features that they would be looking for. Or you want to build a neighborhood grade map that is specific for newlyweds that are looking to grow their families. And you can tailor your formula maybe to look at things like transportation, like I did as well, because these families want to spend more time together. And thus, transportation may be a higher weighting. So, with this live workshop, I plan to cover 4 things. You got a little bit of a sneak peek of the third, but altogether, it'll be working with census data. So, instead of me giving you a clean data set, you will instead actually be reading in data from the API itself, which is super exciting. And it could be a little bit messy, which is why we're going to work as well on pre-processing and creating these features, then developing a geographic score. I'll walk you through a little bit of a slower pace of how I developed that sample one that I did. What I really want you to do is have a use case of what your score should be or who is it for, and then we can develop features based off of that, possibly even some modeling. And then lastly, what good is anything if you can't show it? I want you to be able to create a Streamlit interface for your geographic score so others could use it as well. Especially if you're someone who's new to data analytics and you're looking to break into the field, being able to follow these 4 steps will be an amazing project to showcase for recruiters and future employers. So with that, this was the intro of how to discover markets using AI for real estate. There's more to come on how to actually develop some of these metrics yourself. But if you want to dive right into finding your own deals, become a coffee closer today. You can get started for free using our quick report to search for properties. Thanks.